So let's launch this discussion of the interaction of the two faiths by taking the narrative back to the possibly unifying figure of Jesus. There's a discrepancy for those who are interested in dialogue here, because the Bible doesn't seem to mention Islam or the Prophet Muhammad, but the Quran refers to Christianity repeatedly. So there's always an asymmetry in dialogue. The Muslims have material to work with when they talk about Jesus. The Christians don't have scriptural material to work with when they talk about Muhammad. What's the Quran say about Christianity? Well, sometimes its references are favourable, sometimes they're quite reproachful. For instance, Surah 2, verse 62, those who believe, i.e. the Muslims, and those who are Jews, and the Christians, and the Sabians, we don't need to know who those are for our purposes, whoever believes in God and the last day and acts uprightly, they shall have their reward from their Lord. So apparently a very pluralistic, open statement. Another verse reads, this is Surah 5, verse 82, you will find the closest in love to the believers to be those who say, we are Christians. That is because among them are priests and monks, and because they are not proud. It's quite possible, and many of the Muslim commentators support this, that this verse was revealed shortly after the first Muslims in Mecca had made their migration to Christian Abyssinia, where, as no doubt Dr. Jackson has explained to you, they were received very warmly and given the protection of the Christian king, the Negus. So this verse may be a reflection of that. Another verse. We, i.e. God, gave Jesus the gospel, and in the hearts of his followers we set kindness and mercy. And monasticism, that they invented, we did not prescribe it for them, though they were only desiring to please God, but they did not observe it aright. This is Surah 57, verse 27. In this passage we see a kind of ambiguous criticism of monasticism, which was an enormously important institution in the Middle East at the time the Quran was revealed. And the Prophet himself condemned monasticism rather more forcefully with the words, there is no monasticism in Islam. This is because ultimately Islam sees the world as not fallen, but as capable of reforming itself. Individual souls can reform themselves. The world, human society structures can reform themselves. They are not so ultimately fallen as to need direct divine intervention to do that. Hence you don't need to retreat from the world and live in a monastery if you aspire to holiness. You can do it in the world. You can go through it rather than going around it. Next verse is Surah 5, verse 14, and this is taken as a reference to the new covenant as preached by Paul. With those who say, we are Christians, we made a covenant, but they forgot a part of the admonition. So we stirred up discord and division among them until the day of resurrection. This may be a reference to the great Christological disputes which had thrown the Christian world into sectarian tumult, something that the early Muslims were particularly aware of, since the Middle East was so religiously divided at that time, with Jacobites, Nestorians, Copts, Monophysites, Orthodox, Arians, etc., etc. Perhaps some Christians themselves would agree with the Quranic view that this was some kind of divine punishment for having misunderstood the nature of Jesus. That was how it was understood. However, the most substantial Quranic references to Christian themes are found in the Quran's narratives of the Annunciation and the Nativity. And here we have very extensive passages in the Quran. So, for instance, in Surah 3, verses 31 to 7, we read about the birth of Mary, who is dedicated to God, perhaps as some later Muslim commentators have speculated, as one of the temple virgins in Jerusalem. The text goes on, her Lord accepted her graciously and made her grow in grace. Zachariah took charge of her. Whenever Zachariah entered the sanctuary to her, he found beside her a provision. He said, O Mary, how did you come by this? She replied, it is from God. God provides without reckoning for whomsoever he will. Like several of the Quranic references to the Virgin Mary, this includes non-biblical material. In fact, there's more about the Virgin Mary in the Quran than there is in the New Testament. Perhaps one should point out here the function of Mary in Muslim piety, particularly interesting, obviously, to those who have a Catholic commitment. Virgin Mary is revered in the Quran she works miracles. Some perfectly respectable medieval Muslim theologians have numbered her amongst the prophets because God speaks to her, and that's the definition of what a prophet is, if God speaks to you directly. However, Mary, although her virginity is affirmed, is not regarded as Theotokos, the mother of God, because of course Jesus, in the Muslim view, is not God incarnate, but merely another divinely inspired prophet. So although the Blessed Virgin is very revered by Muslims and is seen as some kind of model, nonetheless she doesn't have such an exalted place in the divine economy of salvation that you'll find her playing in Catholicism. And particularly in recent Catholicism, it was only in 1950 that the doctrine of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin was declared to be divinely inspired doctrine by the Vatican. So again, we have another figure who seems to be a point of contact and possible fruitful interaction between Muslims and Christians. But when we look a little bit further, we see that there are in fact key differences. Mary as a... Sorry, did you have a question?
I think it's interesting that she's still considered a virgin, that have that in the Quran. Is there, has there been philosophical discussion about that? I mean, why... Mm-hmm. Of all the prophets that are born, why is Jesus born that way?
It's just regarded as one of Mary's miracles with no further significance. In the New Testament, obviously, it's regarded as the expression of the immaculate coming into the world of the Logos, who has to come into the world in a way that's unpolluted by fleshly sin or whatever. Islam can't see things in those terms because sexuality has, as in Judaism, been regarded rather more positively in the Muslim tradition than in Christianity. So the accounts of the conception of the Prophet Muhammad, for instance, are quite explicitly sexual. There's no implication of an immaculate conception there. But it's been carried over from Christianity into the Muslim conception, but diminished, if you like, and reduced merely to the level of one of her miracles, rather than anything with great cosmological importance. Another point that's perhaps interesting to bear in mind is Mary as role model. She is another of these four women whom the Prophet mentioned as perfected women, women without sin. However, she has in practice not functioned as a model for Muslim women in the way that she has for Christian women, both Orthodox and Catholic, less so obviously for the Protestant churches. And the reason for this is precisely that her virginity is not, in the Muslim view of things, esteemed or esteemable in the Muslim context in the way that it can be in Christianity. And the role model for Muslim women traditionally has been Fatima, the Prophet's daughter, not the Virgin Mary. And there's an interesting commentary on this by some feminist writers, incidentally. There's an American Catholic, one of the Mary Knoll community of liberal Catholics, who's written a book on women's spirituality. And she points out that one of the problems that some modern women can have with Mary as a model is that it seems that her perfection is conditional upon her transcending of her body and her normal physical functions. And this carried over very much into early Christian ideas of female sanctity, that the ideal woman was a nun, was a virgin, that she rejected motherhood and the normal functions of her gender. In Islam, interestingly, we find, although she is venerated as a kind of unique figure, she's not seen as a model so much as is Fatima. And Fatima's greatness is precisely the fact that she engendered the Prophet's descendants, the Ahl al-Bayt. She is the fertile progenitrix of this effectively spiritual elite amongst the Muslims. And as a model for Muslim women, she affirms rather than questions the spiritual value of motherhood. And Murad O'Neill's book is, I think, quite interesting in drawing this comparison. A little bit more about the Blessed Virgin. In Surah 19, verses 16 to 34, we get the story of the Annunciation. One of the most beautiful passages in the Quran, particularly in Arabic. It has a lovely rhythm, it rhymes, it really is quite exquisite. I have some of it here. I don't know if there's another volunteer for reading this one. Oops, thank you very much.
mentioned in the book Mary, when she withdrew from her people to an easterly place. She took in front of them a veil. Then we sent her to our spirit, who appeared to her as a man without fault. She said, I seek refuge in the merciful God from you, if you fear God. He said, I am but the messenger of God to bestow upon you a pure son. She said, how may I have a son when no man has touched me and I was not unchaste? He said, thus shall it be, your Lord has said, it is easy for me, that we may make him a sign unto the people and a mercy from us. It is a thing decreed.
Okay, so that's quite familiar to Christian readers. It's very similar to the biblical account, although there are a few differences. But then we get the story of the Nativity, which is very different and more or less completely unfamiliar. You want to read the last bit?
And the pains of childbirth drove her to the trunk of a palm tree. She cried, would that I had died before this and had been a thing forgotten. Then he called her from beneath her. Grieve not, the Lord has set before you a stream. Shake towards you the trunk of the palm, and it will drop moist, ripe dates upon you.
Thanks. The narrative continues to describe her bringing the child to her people, and they accuse her of unchastity. She demonstrates the supernatural nature of the happening by pointing to the infant Jesus, who miraculously speaks from his cradle. And he says, Inni Abdullah, I am God's servant. He has given me the book and made me a prophet. He has made me blessed wherever I may be. Now he says this specifically to refute the Pauline take on Christology, which the Quran is concerned to counteract. He says, Inni Abdullah, I am God's servant. Not, I am God, I am the Son of God. I am God's servant. And in Islam's view, that's the highest and most exalted rank to which anybody can aspire, to be a true servant of God. He has given me the book, i.e. Jesus has been given a book. And the Quran affirms that the Injil, which is an Arabization of the word evangelos, the good news, is one of the four written scriptures that we explicitly know have been given to human beings. Whereas in the Christian perspective, of course, Jesus isn't given a book. The book is written about him by the four evangelists. وَجَعَلَنِي نَبِيًّا, and he made me a prophet. Now, Jesus is a prophet according to a certain Christian perspective, but of course he's more than that. So the first three things he says from the cradle are constructed so as to refute the mainstream Christian view of who Jesus of Nazareth was. And then it goes on. This, by the way, is Quran Surah 19, verses 28 to 34. Now, this account, particularly where it touches on the Nativity, is pretty unfamiliar. It's foreign to the four Gospels, foreign to the extra-canonical Gospels. In fact, although there's a lot of legendary material that appeared in the first few centuries after Jesus' birth, we can't find any parallels whatsoever in any of that literature. This is something new. Joseph is written out of the story, so are Bethlehem and the manger. The image instead is the rather austere one of a solitary woman giving birth underneath a palm tree somewhere in the wilderness to the east of Jerusalem, and then returning to face the scandal. The only recognizable feature really is the idea of the virginal conception. So the Quran gives us this fairly full, although fairly unfamiliar, account of Jesus' origin in the world, constructed always for polemical purposes to emphasize his humanity. The doctrine of immaculate conception, which is retained, does not logically conflict with the idea that he was a human being. However, the later career of Jesus is portrayed very thinly indeed. The Quran's really not very interested in it. We're told in Surah 3, verses 45 to 53, that Jesus had Hawariyun, disciples. We learn in Surah 5, verse 110, that he was sent to the children of Israel, confirming the Torah with some amendments. Another important point, in the Muslim view, Jesus lived his life as a believing Jew. He works miracles, he brings the dead to life, that's in the Quran. He heals the blind and the lame, and he brings a clay bird to life. He holds a bird of clay in his hand, breathes on it, and brings it to life. That's not in the four Gospels, but interestingly, it does appear in the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, which was one of the Gospels found at Nag Hammadi in Egypt about 50 years ago. So there is a precedent for that one.